friends, welcome back. It's Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library, and today is day 18 of our read-along together of Roughing It by Mark Twain. We've got a lot of special things to talk about, but I'm going to start with the tea because we've been doing our everyday tea thing. Sorry, that didn't make sense. Every day since this past, all day this week, each day this week, I have been sharing with you a special tea that I learned about during the workshop that I did last Saturday through Tea Source. And so today's tea that I'm drinking is the dark rose tea, and this one's a really neat one. I've had it before because a friend had given me some. Basically, it is a dark tea, and they press it into this shape. So it has, this is just, the ingredients are only dark tea and rose petals. It has a very faint rose petal scent when it's in this dried form, and then when it opens up and expands in the hot water, it does get a really nice rose scent to it. I actually just poured out my water, and I was just gonna put this into the little basket and let it start breaking up. I'll just hold it up while I chat. Oh, I wish you could, sorry about that. It has the basket inside, so you really can't see it as nicely, but we'll just hold it and see if you can, how much you can see. The gentleman who was talking about the tea at the lecture I was at, he said that this one, even though on the packages it recommended steeping it for 30 minutes, he recommended only steeping it for 20 to 30 seconds. So I'm just gonna chit-chat a little bit and then we'll take it out. So it says this one is a dark tea that is full-bodied and smooth with a delicious dusty rose flavor and aroma, made in, and I'm gonna mispronounce this, I'm sorry, Anhua County in Hunan Province of China in 2016. The further information he gave about it during our workshop was he said that, okay, he said that there are, so basically pu'ers are the teas that are, he said that they are teas that have a special process where they have a bit of microbial activity left in them. So they're still kind of alive if you think about it that way. Think of it like a yogurt or something. Ooh. On my side, I can see it sort of starting to separate as the tea is expanding and is no longer holding that rose shape. You can see, I can see a couple of the little leaves like floating up also. But he said that with dark teas, they have the live microbes like yogurt, and they go through a deliberate aging process where they're trying to enhance the microbial activity. And so, and instead it just gives it a really nice flavor. He said originally pu'ers, which are very similar to dark teas, except that he said that pu'ers are only grown, it's a subcategory of dark tea that's grown in the Yunnan province, which is the most southwestern province, he said, of China. And he said it's sort of like how sparkling wines can only be called champagnes technically if they're grown in the Champagne region of France. And so a dark tea is basically a pu'er style tea that it's grown in a different area, a different region than the Yunnan region. And so this is a dark tea, and he said also you can kind of, I wish I could find it, oh, here, this I think I can do without burning my hand. So I'm gonna use the book to hold this up. He said that if you want to like lift the basket a few times, that'll kind of distribute the tea a little bit and separate out the, so I don't know if you can see that. Now it's no longer holding the rose shape at all, and the tea has had a chance to infuse more fully into the water. I'm just going to go ahead and take that out. It can, as he said, steep again a few times, but he recommended after 20 or 30 seconds for the first steeping. So I'm just gonna go and remove my basket. And now I have my tea. So this one has a darker color than the teas we've been enjoying over the week. We progressed from a white tea to a green tea to an oolong tea, and now today a dark tea. And then next week we'll continue again with a pu'er, which is just another variety of dark tea. This one is interesting because with the rose petals mixed in, again, I usually think of dark tea as having a slight bitterness if you leave it in too long, but this, it has such a strong rose scent to it. It's really fun. It's a nice tea. All right, so that is the tea that we are starting with today. The other big news I wanted to share with you, two things. One, today is the anniversary of our first read-along together. Yay! So if you've been reading along with me since the very first book, since we read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte together, I just want to say thank you so much. It has truly been a pleasure. I have absolutely loved every day of getting to read together with you. It's sort of a joke in librarianship, I think, that sometimes when you tell somebody you're a librarian, new acquaintances will say things like, oh, being a librarian, that's great. You must get paid to sit around and read all day. And for the first 20 years of my library career, I had to like refrain from rolling my eyes as I said, actually, no, I don't get paid to read all day. I've got a lot of other stuff I need to do. Thanks to this project, thanks to you guys participating and reading with me, I am finally, for at least 30 to 60 minutes of a day, I get paid to read, and it's wonderful. So thank you very much. I have absolutely loved reading with you. I've enjoyed the books we've read, but even more than that, I've really enjoyed getting to know you guys. And so whether you have been commenting really actively and we've had a bit more interaction, that has been so much fun for me. But I know that there are several of you who sort of watch a little bit and maybe don't comment that much and like, you know, occasionally put in the likes, but also just sort of come in and watch a bit. I've enjoyed reading with you too. Sometimes it's fun just to read, and just the idea of sharing a book with somebody else just makes it that much more special. And I have really treasured this opportunity to get to read with you. So thank you very much for everyone who's been reading with me. Whether you've read all 10 books together with me or just maybe come in here or there, it has been such fun and a delight. And so thank you so much for reading together with our tea group. If you have a glass of tea with you today, I raise my glass to you. I hope you take a sip and just enjoy. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you. And what better way to celebrate our anniversary than with a good tea? Also, my last bit of news too is that speaking of our wonderful 10 books that we've read together, yes, thank you for reading along. It's been so much fun. So if you are interested in seeing what we're going to read next, you still have a chance to have influence on that. I saw today that we now have 5 books that have been nominated in the poll for what we should read next. One of them is pulling ahead. It is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Will we go from the beginning of Charlotte Bronte to our next reading being our 11th book together being Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte? Or do we want to go outside of the Bronte family and read something else? If you would like to vote on the books that we have currently nominated or nominate something else, that poll will be open through next Monday, at which point at 3 o'clock next Monday, we're going to announce our winner, our next read. So thank you very much for reading with me. Truly, I have absolutely loved it, and it's just been such a pleasure. So let's talk a bit about our current book that we're reading together, which is Roughing It by Mark Twain. Yesterday we read 4 chapters, and today we're going to read 4 more short chapters. So let's see. Yesterday we read... Okay, I did figure out why he was in San Francisco. Yesterday I'd mentioned I wasn't sure why he went to San Francisco on his way to New York, but it was because he was going to catch a ship from San Francisco to take him to New York. And he starts out talking about in San Francisco, he felt like he had a lot of money. He had a lot of stocks and he had a lot of investments in the various mines, and he believed that they were going to keep going up. And so he was just spending money. He was going to the opera, he was going to theater, he had a nice hotel, he was going dancing. He was, he was having a great time. And then suddenly the market kind of crashed. And he was worried about, before the market crashes, there was also an earthquake. And, sorry, there was a bit of speculation. Yeah, things went a little downhill. And he found out, too, that he was supposed to be going to New York with those other fellows to try to sell to the New Yorkers interest in one of the Nevada mines. And he was working, by the way, as a reporter also. There was a little bit of a crash, and so he lost... all of his stocks were not worth anything, so he threw those away. He's like, but I'm still gonna make money off that Nevada mine that we're gonna sell to the New Yorkers. It's okay. And so while he was waiting for the folks to go with him to New York to sell that mine, he started working as a reporter. And he said that one day he just didn't feel well, so he didn't go into work. When the next day when he went in, that was the day that he saw a note that had arrived the previous day when he was out sick. And it was from the gentlemen who were going to New York. And they said, hey, meet with us tonight. We're going to leave tomorrow on our ship to New York. We're going to sell that mine. It's going to be great. And because he had missed work one day, he didn't see that note. He rushed off to meet them at the dock, though, and he got there just as the ship was leaving. And he was so heartbroken. And basically, he was feeling really unhappy about things. Also, he mentions that along the way, there was an earthquake in San Francisco. He has a beautiful description of the destruction wrought by the earthquake and how it discombobulated everyone around. But then he talks more too in the next chapter about how after he lost that opportunity to go with the other friends, to the other people to sell that mine, he was just really desolate because he saw the newspaper that that mine had been sold for quite a large sum of money. and that he had missed his opportunity to make money on that venture. And so he was just really beating himself up, and he was so upset about it, and he started slacking off at his job. He stopped performing well, and basically his boss offered him the opportunity to resign rather than be fired. And so Mark Twain at this point has no job. He's in San Francisco. He's slinking around from place to place, trying to avoid having to pay his bills. And he just doesn't have very much money. He tells some other stories about some people who are experiencing poverty, that they are, that they've lost their fortunes in the West. And a friend of his comes down from Tuolumne, California, and invites him to go with him to these old sort of abandoned mines to kind of try to do this thing of pocket hunting, which is digging tiny little holes to hope for just a tiny little pocket of gold. It may not be a large mine. It may just be a couple $100, maybe a couple $1,000. You might get really lucky and get like $50,000 or $60,000, but it's usually just a discrete section where there's that gold, and getting that. And so he tells these stories about pocket mining and says, this isn't something that's told a lot about, this type of mining, so I'm just going to share this with you, like a little bit of education. Let's see. He talks to the story about a gentleman that he met out there who was having some trouble with the mining. It was a cute story about the cat, but I want to get to the next section where he talks about some other things he's going to be doing. And I wanted to say... Yes, okay, so just leading into this next section, I'm just going to mention that the Sandwich Islands is what we used to call the Hawaiian Islands. So when he refers to the Sandwich Islands, which are coming up in today's reading, think Hawaii, okay? And then also, as I have said many times over the course of the past year, hey, we have a whole anniversary under our belts now. I apologize in advance for my many mispronunciations as we're going into a Hawaiian section. I looked at one little line and I was like, oh dear, I will do my best. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. Today we're going to read 4 chapters, chapters 62 to 65 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 62. After a 3 months absence, I found myself in San Francisco again, without a cent. When my credit was about exhausted, for I'd become too mean and lazy now to work on a morning paper, and there were no vacancies on the evening journals, I was created San Francisco correspondent of the Enterprise. And at the end of 5 months, I was out of debt, but my interest in my work was gone. For my correspondence being a daily one, without rest or respite, I got unspeakably tired of it. I wanted another change. The vagabond instinct was strong upon me. Fortune favored, and I got a new berth, and a delightful one. It was to go down to the Sandwich Islands and write some letters for the Sacramento Union, an excellent journal and liberal with employees. We sailed in the propeller Ajax in the middle of winter. The almanac called it winter, distinctly enough, but the weather was a compromise between spring and summer. 6 days out of port, it became summer altogether. We had some 30 passengers, among them a cheerful soul by the name of Williams, and 3 sea-worn old whale-ship captains going down to join their vessels. These latter played euchre in the smoking room day and night, drank astonishing quantities of raw whiskey without being in the least affected by it, and were the happiest people I think I ever saw. And then there was the old Admiral, a retired whaleman. He was a roaring, terrific combination of wind and lightning and thunder, and earnest, whole-souled profanity. But nevertheless, he was tender-hearted as a girl. He was a raving, deafening, devastating typhoon, laying waste the cowering seas, but with an unvexed refuge in the center, where all comers were safe and at rest. Nobody could know the Admiral without liking him, and in a sudden and dire emergency, I think no friend of his would know which to choose, to be cursed by him or prayed for by a less efficient person. His title of Admiral was more strictly official than any ever worn by a naval officer before or since, perhaps, for it was the voluntary offering of a whole nation and came direct from the people themselves without any intermediate red tape, the people of the Sandwich Islands. It was a title that came to him freighted with affection and honor and appreciation of his unpretending merit. And in testimony of the genuineness of the title, it was publicly ordained that an exclusive flag should be devised for him and used solely to welcome his coming and wave him Godspeed in his going. From that time forth, whenever his ship was signaled in the offing, or he catted his anchor and stood out to sea, that ensign streamed from the royal halyards on the Parliament House, and the nation lifted their hats to it with spontaneous accord. Yet he had never fired a gun or fought a battle in his life. But these details were only secondary matters. Oh, excuse me. I flipped 2 pages. When I knew him on board the Ajax, he was 72 years old and had plowed the salt water 61 of them. For 16 years he had gone in and out of the harbor of Honolulu in command of a whale ship, and for 16 more had been captain of a San Francisco and Sandwich Island passenger packet and had never had an accident or lost a vessel. The simple natives knew him for a friend who never failed them, and regarded him as children regard a father. It was a dangerous thing to oppress them when the roaring Admiral was around. 2 years before I knew the Admiral, he had retired from the sea on a competence and had sworn a colossal 9-jointed oath that he would never go within smelling distance of the salt water again as long as he lived. And he had conscientiously kept it. That is to say, he considered he had kept it, and it would have been more than dangerous to suggest to him, even in the gentlest way, that making 11 long sea voyages as a passenger during the 2 years that had transpired since he retired was only keeping the general spirit of it and not the strict letter. The Admiral knew only one narrow line of conduct to pursue in any and all cases where there was a fight, and that was to shoulder his way straight in without an inquiry as to the rights or the merits of it, and take the part of the weaker side. And this was the reason why he was always sure to be present at the trial of any universally execrated criminal, to oppress and intimidate the jury with the vindictive pantomime of what he would do to them if he ever caught them out of the box. And this was why harried cats and outlawed dogs that knew him confidently took sanctuary under his chair in time of trouble. In the beginning, he was the most frantic and bloodthirsty Union man that drew breath in the shadow of the flag. But the instant the Southerners began to go down before the sweep of the Northern armies, he ran up the Confederate colors, and from that time till the end was a rampant and inexorable secessionist. He hated intemperance with a more uncompromising animosity than any individual I have ever met of either sex, and he was never tired of storming against it and beseeching friends and strangers alike to be wary and drink with moderation. And yet, if any creature had been guileless enough to intimate that his absorbing 9 gallons of straight whiskey during our voyage was any fraction short of rigid or inflexible abstemiousness, in that self-same moment the old man would have spun him to the uttermost parts of the earth in the whirlwind of his wrath. Mind, I am not saying his whiskey ever affected his head or his legs, for it did not, in even the slightest degree. He was a capacious container, but he did not hold enough for that. He took a level tumblerful of whiskey every morning before he put his clothes on, to sweeten his bilge water, he said. He took another after he got the most of his clothes on, to settle his mind and give him his bearings. He then shaved and put on a clean shirt, after which he recited the Lord's Prayer in a fervent, thundering bass that shook the ship to her kelson and suspended all conversation in the main cabin. Then, at this stage, being invariably by the head, or by the stern, or listed to port or starboard, he took one more to put him on an even keel, so that he would mind his helm and not miss stays and go about every time he came up in the wind. And now his stateroom door swung open, and the sun of his benignant face beamed redly out upon men and women and children, and he roared his "Shipmates ahoy!" in a way that was calculated to wake the dead and precipitate the final resurrection. And forth he strode, a picture to look at and a presence to enforce attention. Stalwart and portly, not a gray hair, broad-brimmed slouch hat, semi-sailor toggery of blue navy flannel, roomy and ample, a stately expanse of shirt front and a liberal amount of black silk neckcloth tied with a sailor knot, large chain and imposing seals impending from his fob, awe-inspiring feet and a hand like the hand of Providence, as his whaling brethren expressed it, wristbands and sleeves pushed back halfway to the elbow out of respect for the warm weather, and exposing hairy arms, gaudy with red and blue anchors, ships, and goddesses of liberty tattooed in India ink. But these details were only secondary matters. His face was the lodestone that chained the eye. It was a sultry disk, glowing determinedly out through a weather-beaten mask of mahogany and studded with warts, seamed with scars, blazed all over with unfailing fresh slips of the razor, and with cheery eyes under shaggy brows, contemplating the world from over the back of a gnarled crag of a nose that loomed vast and lonely out of the undulating immensity that spread away from its foundations. At his heels frisked the darling of his bachelor estate, his terrier, Fan, a creature no larger than a squirrel. Fan, in a motherly way, the main part of his daily life was occupied in looking after Fan in a motherly way and doctoring her for 100 ailments which existed only in his imagination. There he is with Fan. The Admiral seldom read newspapers, and when he did, he never believed anything they said. He read nothing and believed in nothing but The Old Guard, a succession periodical published in New York. He carried a dozen copies of it with him always and referred to them for all required information. If it was not there, he supplied it himself out of a bountiful fancy, inventing history, names, dates, and everything else necessary to make his point good in an argument. Consequently, he was a formidable antagonist in a dispute. Whenever he swung clear of the record and began to create history, the enemy was helpless and had to surrender. Indeed, the enemy could not keep from betraying some little spark of indignation at his manufactured history, and when it came to indignation, that was the Admiral's very best hold. He was always ready for a political argument, and if nobody started one, he would do it himself. With his third retort, his temper would begin to rise, and within 5 minutes he would be blowing a gale, and within 15 his smoking room audience would be utterly stormed away, and the old man left solitary and alone, banging the table with his fist, kicking the chairs, and roaring a hurricane of profanity. It got so, after a while, that whenever the Admiral approached with politics in his eye, the passengers would drop out with quiet accord, afraid to meet him, and he would camp on a deserted field. But he found his match at last, and before a full company. At one time or another, everybody had entered the lists against him and been routed, except the quiet passenger, Williams. He had never been able to get an expression of opinion out of him on politics, but now, just as the Admiral drew near the door and the company were about to slip out, Williams said, "Admiral, are you certain about that circumstance concerning the clergyman you mentioned the other day?" referring to a piece of the Admiral's manufactured history. Everyone was amazed at the man's rashness. The idea of deliberately inviting annihilation was a thing incomprehensible. The retreat came to a halt. Then everybody sat down again, wondering to await the upshot of it. The Admiral himself was as surprised as anyone. He paused in the door with his red handkerchief half raised to his sweating face and contemplated the daring reptile in the corner. "Certain of it? Am I certain of it? Do you think I've been lying about it? What do you take me for? Anybody that don't know that circumstance don't know anything. A child ought to know it. Read up your history. Read it up. And don't come asking a man if he's certain about a bit of ABC stuff that the very southern niggers know all about." Here the Admiral's fires began to wax hot, and the atmosphere thickened. The coming earthquake rumbled. He began to thunder and lighten. Within 3 minutes, his volcano was in full eruption, and he was discharging flames and ashes of indignation, belching black volumes of foul history aloft, and vomiting red-hot torrents of profanity from his crater. Meantime, William sat silent and apparently deeply and earnestly interested in what the old man was saying. By and by, when the lull came, he said in the most deferential way, and with the gratified air of a man who has had a mystery cleared up which had been puzzling him uncomfortably, "Now I understand it. I always thought I knew that piece of history well enough, but was still afraid to trust it, because there was not that convincing particularity about it that one likes to have in history. But when you mentioned every name the other day, and every date, and every little circumstance in their just order and sequence, I said to myself, this sounds something like. This is history. This is putting it in a shape that gives a man confidence, and I said to myself afterward, I will just ask the Admiral if he is perfectly certain about the details, and if he is, I will come out and thank him for clearing this matter up for me. And that is what I want to do now, for until you set that matter right, it was nothing but just a confusion in my mind without head or tail to it. Nobody ever saw the Admiral look so mollified before, and so pleased. Nobody had ever received his bogus history as gospel before. Its genuineness had always been called in question either by words or looks, but here was a man that not only swallowed it all down, but was grateful for the dose. He was taken aback. He hardly knew what to say. Even his profanity failed him. Now Williams continued, modestly and earnestly, "But, Admiral, in saying that this was the first stone thrown, and that this precipitated the war, you have overlooked a circumstance which you are perfectly familiar with, but which has escaped your memory. Now I grant you that what you have stated is correct in every detail, to wit, that on the 16th of October, 1860, 2 Massachusetts clergymen named Waite and Granger went in disguise to the house of John Moody in Rockport at dead of night, and dragged forth 2 Southern women and their 2 little children, and after tarring and feathering them, conveyed them to Boston, and burned them alive in the State House Square. And I also grant your proposition that this deed is what led to the secession of South Carolina on the 20th of December following. Very well." Here the company were pleasantly surprised to hear William proceed to come back at the Admiral with his own invincible weapon, clean, pure, manufactured history, without a word of truth in it. "Very well, I say. But, Admiral, why overlook the Willis and Morgan case in South Carolina? You are too well-informed a man not to know all about that circumstance. Your arguments and your conversations have shown you to be intimately conversant with every detail of this national quarrel. You develop matters of history every day that show plainly that you are no smatterer in it, content to nibble about the surface, but a man who has searched the depths and possessed yourself of everything that has a bearing upon the great question. Therefore, let me just recall to your mind that Willis and Morgan case, though I see by your face that the whole thing is already passing through your memory at this moment. On the 12th of August, 1860, 2 months before the Waite and Granger affair, 2 South Carolina clergymen named John H. Morgan and Winthrop L. Willis, one a Methodist and the other an Old School Baptist, disguised themselves and went at midnight to the house of a planter named Thompson, Archibald F. Thompson, vice president under Thomas Jefferson, and took thence at midnight his widowed aunt, a northern woman, and her adopted child, an orphan named Mortimer High, afflicted with epilepsy and suffering at the time from white swelling on one of his legs, and compelled to walk on crutches in consequence. And the 2 ministers, in spite of the pleadings of the victims, dragged them to the bush, tarred and feathered them, and afterward burned them at the stake in the city of Charleston. You remember perfectly well what a stir it made. You remember perfectly well that even the Charleston Courier stigmatized the act as being unpleasant, of questionable propriety, and scarcely justifiable, and likewise that it would not be matter of surprise if retaliation ensued. And you remember also that this thing was the cause of the Massachusetts outrage. Who indeed were the 2 Massachusetts ministers, and who were the 2 Southern women they burned? I do not need to remind you, Admiral, with your intimate knowledge of history, that Waite was the nephew of the woman burned in Charleston, that Granger was her cousin in the 2nd degree, and that the woman they burned in Boston was the wife of John H. Morgan, and the still loved but divorced wife of Winthrop L. Willis. Now, Admiral, it is only fair that you should acknowledge that the first provocation came from the Southern preachers, and that the Northern ones were justified in retaliating. In your arguments, you never yet have shown the least disposition to withhold a just verdict or be in any wise unfair, when authoritative history condemned your position, and therefore I have no hesitation in asking you to take the original blame from the Massachusetts ministers in this matter and transfer it to the South Carolina clergymen, where it justly belongs." The Admiral was conquered. This sweet-spoken creature who swallowed his fraudulent history as if it were the bread of life, basked in his furious blasphemy as if it were generous sunshine, found only calm, even-handed justice in his rampart partisanship, and flooded him with invented history so sugar-coated with flattery and deference that there was no rejecting it, was too many for him. He stammered some awkward, profane sentences about the Willis and Morgan business having escaped his memory, but that he remembered it now. And then, under pretense of giving Fan some medicine for an imaginary cough, drew out of the battle and went away, a vanquished man. Then cheers and laughter went up, and Williams, the ship's benefactor, was a hero. The news went about the vessel, champagne was ordered, an enthusiastic reception instituted in the smoking room, and everybody flocked thither to shake hands with the conqueror. The wheelsman said afterward that the Admiral stood up behind the pilot house and ripped and cursed all to himself till he loosened the smokestack guys and becalmed the mainsail. The Admiral's power was broken. After that, if he began an argument, somebody would bring Williams, and the old man would grow weak and begin to quiet down at once. And as soon as he was done, Williams, in his dulcet, insinuating way, would invent some history, referring for proof to the old man's own excellent memory and to copies of the old guard known not to be in his possession, that would turn the tables completely and leave the Admiral all abroad and helpless. By and by he came to so dread Williams and his gilded tongue that he would stop talking when he saw him approach, and finally ceased to mention politics altogether, and from that time forward there was entire peace and serenity in the ship. And now chapter 63. On a certain bright morning, the islands hove in sight, lying low on the lonely sea, and everybody climbed to the upper deck to look. About 2,000 miles of watery solitude, after 2,000 miles of watery solitude, the vision was a welcome one. As we approached, the imposing promontory of Diamond Head came up out of the ocean, its rugged front softened by the hazy distance, and presently the details of the land began to make themselves manifest. First, the line of beach, then the plumed coconut trees of the tropics, then cabins of the natives, then the white town of Honolulu, said to contain between 12 and 15,000 inhabitants spread over a dead level, with streets from 20 to 30 feet wide, solid and level as a floor, most of them straight as a line, and few as crooked as a corkscrew. The further I traveled through the town, the better I liked it. Every step revealed a new contrast, disclosed something I was unaccustomed to. In place of the grand, mud-colored brown fronts of San Francisco, I saw dwellings built of straw, adobes, and cream-colored pebble and shell conglomerated coral, cut into oblong blocks and laid in cement. Also a great number of neat white cottages with green window shutters. In place of front yards like billiard tables with iron fences around them, I saw these homes surrounded by ample yards, thickly clad with green grass and shaded by tall trees, through whose dense foliage the sun could scarcely penetrate. In place of the customary geranium, calla lily, etc., languishing in dust and general debility, I saw luxurious banks and thickets of flowers, fresh as a meadow after a rain, and glowing with the richest dyes. In place of the dingy horrors of San Francisco's pleasure grove, the willows, I saw huge-bodied, wide-spreading forest trees with strange names and stranger appearance. Trees that cast a shadow like a thundercloud and were able to stand alone without being tied to green poles. In place of goldfish wiggling around in glass globes, assuming countless shades and degrees of distortion through the magnifying and diminishing qualities of their transparent prison houses, I saw cats. Tomcats, Marianne cats, long-tailed cats, bob-tailed cats, blind cats, one-eyed cats, wall-eyed cats, cross-eyed cats, gray cats, black cats, white cats, yellow cats, striped cats, spotted cats, tame cats, wild cats, singed cats, individual cats, groups of cats, platoons of cats, companies of cats, regiments of cats, armies of cats, multitudes of cats, millions of cats, and all of them sleek, fat, lazy, and sound asleep. I looked on a multitude of people, some white in white coats, vests, pantaloons, even white cloth shoes, made snowy with chalk duly laid on every morning. But the majority of the people were almost as dark as Negroes, women with comely features, fine black eyes, rounded forms, inclining to the voluptuous, clad in a single bright red or white garment that fell free and unconfined from shoulder to heel, long black hair falling loose, gypsy hats encircled with wreaths of natural flowers of a brilliant carmine tint, plenty of dark men in various costumes, and some with nothing on but a battered stovepipe hat tilted on the nose and a very scant breechclout. Certain smoke-dried children were clothed in nothing but sunshine, a very neat-fitting and picturesque apparel indeed. In place of roughs and rowdies staring and blackguarding on the corners, I saw long-haired, saddle-colored Sandwich Island maidens sitting on the ground in the shade of corner houses, gazing indolently at whatever or whoever happened along. Instead of wretched cobblestone pavements, I walked on a firm foundation of coral built up from the bottom of the sea by the absurd but persevering insect of that name, with a light layer of lava and cinders overlying the coral, belched up out of fathomless perdition long ago through the seared and blackened crater that stands dead and harmless in the distance now. Instead of cramped and crowded streetcars, I met dusky native women sweeping by, free as the wind, on fleet horses and astride, with Gandhi riding sashes streaming like banners behind them. Instead of the combined stenches of Chinadom and Brannan Street slaughterhouses, I breathed the balmy fragrance of jessamine, oleander, and the pride of India. In place of the hurry and bustle and noisy confusion of San Francisco, I moved in the midst of a summer calm as tranquil as dawn in the Garden of Eden. In place of the golden cities skirting sandhills in the placid bay, I saw on the one side a framework of tall, precipitous mountains close at hand, clad in refreshing green and cleft by deep, cool, chasm-like valleys, and in front the grand sweep of the ocean, a brilliant, transparent green near the shore, bound and bordered by a long white line of foamy spray dashing against the reef, and further out the dead blue water of the deep sea, flecked with white caps, and in the far horizon a single lonely sail, a mere accent mark to emphasize a slumberous calm and a solitude that were without sound or limit. When the sun had sunk, the one intruder from other realms and persistent in suggestions of them, it from other realms and, it was tranced luxury to sit in the perfumed air and forget there was any world but these enchanted islands. It was such ecstasy to dream, and dream till you got a bite. A scorpion bite. Then the first duty was to get up out of the grass and kill the scorpion, and the next to bathe the bitten place with alcohol or brandy, and the next to resolve to keep out of the grass in future. Then came an adjournment to the bedchamber and the pastime of writing up the day's journal with one hand and the destruction of mosquitoes with the other. A whole community of them at a slap. Then, on observing an enemy approaching, a hairy tarantula on stilts, why not set the spittoon on him? It is done, and the projecting ends of his paws give a luminous idea of the magnitude of his reach. Then to bed, and become a promenade for a centipede with 42 legs on a side, and every foot hot enough to burn a hole through a rawhide. More soaking with alcohol, and a resolution to examine the bed before entering it in future. Then wait and suffer till all the mosquitoes in the neighborhood have crawled in under the bar, then slip out quickly, shut them in, and sleep peacefully on the floor till morning. Meantime, it is comforting to curse the tropics in occasional wakeful intervals. We had an abundance of fruit in Honolulu, of course. Oranges, pineapples, bananas, strawberries, lemons, limes, mangoes, guavas, melons, and a rare and curious luxury called the chirimoya, which is deliciousness itself. Then there is the tamarind. I thought tamarinds were made to eat, but that was probably not the idea. I ate several, and it seemed to me that they were rather sour that year. They pursed at my lips till they resembled the stem end of a tomato, and I had to take my sustenance through a quill for 24 hours. They sharpened my teeth till I could have shaved with them and gave them a wire edge that I was afraid would stay. But a citizen said, "No, it will come off when the enamel does," which was comforting at any rate. I found afterward that only strangers eat tamarinds, but they only eat them once. Here's a drawing of him with a tamarind, or after eating the tamarinds. And then also in the bed with a centipede. And now chapter 64. In my diary of our third day in Honolulu, I find this. I am probably the most sensitive man in Hawaii tonight, especially about sitting down in the presence of my betters. I have ridden 15 or 20 miles on horseback since 5 p.m., and to tell the honest truth, I have a delicacy about sitting down at all. An excursion to Diamond Head in the King's Coconut Grove was planned today. Time, 4:30 p.m. The party to consist of half a dozen gentlemen and 3 ladies. They all started at the appointed hour, except myself. I was at the government prison, with Captain Fish and another whale ship skipper, Captain Phillips, and got so interested in its examination that I did not notice how quickly the time was passing. Somebody remarked that it was 20 minutes past 5 o'clock, and that woke me up. It was a fortunate circumstance that Captain Phillips was along with his turnout, as he calls a top buggy that Captain Cook brought here in 1778, and a horse that was here when Captain Cook came. Captain Phillips takes a just pride in his driving, and in the speed of his horse, and to his passion for displaying them, I owe it that we were only 16 minutes coming from the prison to the American Hotel, a distance which has been estimated to be over half a mile. But it took some fearful driving. The captain's whip came down fast, and the blows started so much dust out of the horse's hide that during the last half of the journey we rode through an impenetrable fog and ran by a pocket compass in the hands of Captain Fish, a whaler of 26 years' experience who sat there through the perilous voyage as self-possessed as if he had been on the euchre deck of his own ship, and calmly said, "Port your helm, port," from time to time, and "Hold her a little free, steady, so," and "Luff, hard down to starboard," and never once lost his presence of mind or betrayed the least anxiety by voice or manner. When we came to anchor at last, and Captain Phillips looked at his watch and said, 16 minutes, I told you it was in her, that's over 3 miles an hour. I could see he felt entitled to a compliment, and so I said I had never seen lightning go like that horse, and I never had. The landlady of the American said the party had been gone nearly an hour, but that he could give me my choice. The landlord of the American said the party had been gone nearly an hour, but that he could give me my choice of several horses that could overtake them. I said, never mind. I preferred a safe horse to a fast one. I would like to have an excessively gentle horse, a horse with no spirit whatever, a lame one if he had such a thing. Inside of 5 minutes I was mounted and perfectly satisfied with my outfit. I had no time to label him, "This is a horse," and so if the public took him for a sheep, I cannot help it. I was satisfied, and that was the main thing. I could see that he had as many fine points as any man's horse, and so I hung my hat on one of them behind the saddle and swabbed the perspiration from my face and started. I named him after this island, Oahu, pronounced Owahi. That's what it says. The first gate he came to, he started in. I had neither whip nor spur, and so I simply argued the case with him. He resisted argument, but ultimately yielded to insult and abuse. He backed out of that gate and steered for another one on the other side of the street. I triumphed by my former process. Within the next 600 yards, he crossed the street 14 times and attempted 13 gates, and in the meantime, the tropical sun was beating down and threatening to cave the top of my head in, and I was literally dripping with perspiration. He abandoned the gate business after that and went along peaceably enough, but absorbed in meditation. I noticed this latter circumstance, and it soon began to fill me with apprehension. I said to myself, this creature is planning some new outrage, some fresh deviltry or other. No horse ever thought over a subject so profoundly as this one is doing just for nothing. The more this thing preyed upon my mind, the more uneasy I became, until the suspense became almost unbearable, and I dismounted to see if there was anything wild in his eye, for I had heard that the eye of this noblest of our domestic animals is very expressive. I cannot describe what a load of anxiety was lifted from my mind when I found that he was only asleep. I woke him and started him into a faster walk, and then the villainy of his nature came out again. He tried to climb over a stone wall, 5 or 6 feet high. I saw that I must apply force to this horse, and that I might as well begin first as last. I plucked a stout switch from a tamarind tree, and the moment he saw it, he surrendered. He broke into a convulsive sort of a canter, which had 3 short steps in it and 1 long one, and reminded me alternately of the clattering shake of the great earthquake and the sweeping plunge of the Ajax in a storm. And now there can be no fitter occasion than the present to pronounce a left-handed blessing upon the man who invented the American saddle. There is no seat to speak of about it. One might as well sit in a shovel, and the stirrups are nothing but an ornamental nuisance. If I were to write down here all the abuse I expended on those stirrups, it would make a great book, even without pictures. Sometimes I got one foot so far through that the stirrups partook of the nature of an anklet. Sometimes both feet were through, and I was handcuffed by the legs. And sometimes my feet got clear out and left the stirrups wildly dangling about my shins. Even when I was in proper position and carefully balanced upon the balls of my feet, there was no comfort in it, on account of my nervous dread that they were going to slip one way or the other in a moment. But the subject is too exasperating to write about. A mile and a half from town, I came to a grove of tall coconut trees with clean, branchless stems reaching straight up 60 or 70 feet and topped with a spray of green foliage sheltering clusters of coconuts. Not more picturesque than a forest of colossal ragged parasols with bunches of magnified grapes under them would be. I once heard a grouty northern invalid say that a coconut tree might be poetical. Possibly it was, but it looked like a feather duster struck by lightning. I think that describes it better than a picture, and yet, without any question, there is something fascinating about a coconut tree, and graceful, too. About a dozen cottages, some frame and the others of native grass, nestled sleepily in the shade here and there. The grass cabins are of a grayish color, are shaped much like our own cottages, only with higher and steeper roofs usually, and are made of some kind of weed strongly bound together in bundles. The roofs are very thick, and so are the walls. The latter have square holes in them for windows. At a little distance, these cabins have a furry appearance, as if they might be made of bear skins. They are very cool and pleasant inside. The king's flag was flying from the roof of one of the cottages, and his majesty was probably within. He owns the whole concern thereabouts, and passes his time there frequently on sultry days laying off. The spot is called the King's Grove. Nearby is an interesting ruin, the meager remains of an ancient heathen temple, a place where human sacrifices were offered up in those old bygone days when the simple child of nature, yielding momentarily to sin when sorely tempted, acknowledged his error when calm reflection had shown it him, and came forward with noble frankness and offered up his grandmother as an atoning sacrifice. In those old days when the luckless sinner could keep on cleansing his conscience and achieving periodical happiness as long as his relations held out. Long, long before the missionaries braved 1,000 privations to come and make them permanently miserable by telling them how beautiful and how blissful a place heaven is, and how nearly impossible it is to get there, and showed the poor native how dreary a place perdition is, and what unnecessarily liberal facilities there are for going to it, showed him how, in his ignorance, he had gone and fooled away all his kinfolks to no purpose, showed him what rapture is to work all day long for 50 cents to buy food for next day with, as compared with fishing for pastime and lolling in the shade through eternal summer, and eating of the bounty that nobody labored to provide but nature. How sad it is to think of the multitudes who have gone to their graves in this beautiful island and never knew there was a hell. This ancient temple was built of rough blocks of lava and was simply a roofless enclosure 130 feet long and 70 wide. Nothing but naked walls, very thick, but not much higher than a man's head. They will last for ages, no doubt, if left unmolested. Its 3 altars and other sacred appurtenances have crumbled and passed away years ago. It is said that in the old times, thousands of human beings were slaughtered here in the presence of naked and howling savages. If these mute stones could speak, what tales they could tell, what pictures they could describe of fettered victims writhing under the knife, of massed forms straining forward out of the gloom, with ferocious faces lit up by the sacrificial fires, of the background of ghostly trees, of the dark pyramid of diamond heads standing sentinel over the uncanny scene, and the peaceful moon looking down upon it through rifts in the cloud rack. When Kamehameha, pronounced Kamehameha, the Great, who was a sort of a Napoleon in military genius and uniform success, invaded this island of Oahu 3/4 of a century ago and exterminated the army sent to oppose him and took full and final possession of the country, he searched out the dead body of the king of Oahu and those of the principal chiefs and impaled their heads on the walls of this temple. Those were savage times when this old slaughterhouse was in its prime. The king and the chiefs ruled the common herd with a rod of iron, made them gather all the provisions the masters needed, build all the houses and temples, stand all the expenses of whatever kind, take kicks and cuffs for thanks, drag out lives well flavored with misery, and then suffer death for trifling offenses, or yield up their lives on the sacrificial altars to purchase favors from the gods for their hard rulers. The missionaries have clothed them, educated them, broken up the tyrannous authority of their chiefs, and given them freedom and the right to enjoy whatever their lands and brains produce with equal laws for all, and punishment for all alike who transgress them. The contrast is so strong. The benefit conferred upon this people by the missionaries is so prominent, so palpable, and so unquestionable that the frankest compliment I can pay them, and the best, is simply to point to the condition of the Sandwich Islanders of Captain Cook's time and their condition today. Their work speaks for itself. By and by, after a rugged... Chapter 65. By and by, after a rugged climb, we halted on the summit of a hill which commanded a far-reaching view. The moon rose and flooded mountain and valley and ocean with a mellow radiance, and out of the shadows of the foliage the distant lights of Honolulu glinted like an encampment of fireflies. The air was heavy with the fragrance of flowers. The halt was brief. Gaily laughing and talking, the party galloped on, and I clung to the pommel and cantered after. Presently we came to a place where no grass grew, a wide expanse of deep sand. They said it was an old battleground. All around everywhere, not 3 feet apart, the bleached bones of men gleamed white in the moonlight. We picked up a lot of them for mementos. I got quite a number of arm bones and leg bones, of great chiefs, maybe, who had fought savagely in that fearful battle in the old days, when blood flowed like wine where we now stood, and wore the choicest of them out on Oahu afterwards, trying to make him go. All sorts of bones could be found except skulls. But a citizen said, irreverently, that there had been an unusual number of skull hunters there lately, a species of sportsman I had never heard of before. Nothing whatever is known about this place. Its story is a secret that will never be revealed. The oldest natives make no pretense of being possessed of its history. They say these bones were here when they were children. They were here when their grandfathers were children, but how they came here, they can only conjecture. Many people believe this spot to be an ancient battleground, and it is usual to call it so, and they believe that these skeletons have lain for ages just where their proprietors fell in the great fight. Other people believe that Kamehameha I fought his first battle here. On this point, I have heard a story which may have been taken from one of the numerous books which have been written concerning these islands. I do not know where the narrator got it. He said that when Kamehameha, who was at first merely a subordinate chief on the island of Hawaii, landed here, he brought a large army with him and encamped at Waikiki. The Oahuans marched against him, and so confident were they of success that they readily acceded to a demand of their priests that they should draw a line where these bones now lie, and take an oath that if forced to retreat at all, they would never retreat beyond this boundary. The priests told them that death and everlasting punishment would overtake any who violated the oath, and the march was resumed. Kamehameha drove them back step by step. The priests fought in the front rank and exhorted them both by voice and inspiring example to remember their oath, to die if need be, but never cross the fatal line. The struggle was manfully maintained, but at last the chief priest fell, pierced to the heart with a spear, and the unlucky omen fell like a blight upon the brave souls at his back. With a triumphant shout, the invaders pressed forward. The line was crossed. The offended gods deserted the despairing army, and accepting the doom their perjury had brought upon them, they broke and fled over the plain where Honolulu stands now, up the beautiful Nuuanu Valley, paused a moment, hemmed in by precipitous mountains on one side and the frightful precipice of the Pari in front, and then were driven over, a sheer plunge of 600 feet. The story is pretty enough, but Mr. Jarvis's excellent history says the Oahuans were entrenched in Nuuanu Valley, that Kamehameha ousted them, routed them, pursued them up the valley, and drove them over the precipice. He makes no mention of our boneyard at all in his book. Impressed by the profound silence and repose that rested over the beautiful landscape, and being, as usual, in the rear, I gave voice to my thoughts. I said, "What a picture is here slumbering in the solemn glory of the moon! How strong the rugged outlines of the dead volcanoes stand against the clear sky! What a snowy fringe marks the bursting of the surf over the long curved reef! How calmly the dim city sleeps yonder in the plain! How soft the shadows lie upon the stately mountains that border the dream-haunted Mauoa Valley! What a grand pyramid of billowy clouds towers above the storied Pari! How the grim warriors of the past seem flocking in ghostly squadrons to their ancient battlefield again! How the wails of the dying well up from the... At this point, the horse called Oahu sat down in the sand. Sat down to listen, I suppose. Never mind what he heard. I stopped apostrophizing and convinced him that I was not a man to allow contempt of court on the part of a horse. I broke the backbone of a chief over his rump and set out to join the cavalcade again. Very considerably fagged out, we arrived in town at 9 o'clock at night, myself in the lead, for when my horse finally came to understand that he was homeward bound and hadn't far to go, he turned his attention strictly to business. This is a good time to drop in a paragraph of information. There is no regular livery stable in Honolulu, or indeed in any part of the kingdom of Hawaii. Therefore, unless you are acquainted with wealthy residents, who all have good horses, you must hire animals of the wretchedest description from the Kanakas, i.e. natives. Any horse you hire, even though it be from a white man, is not often of much account, because it will be brought in for you from some ranch and has necessarily been leading a hard life. If the Kanakas who have been caring for him, inveterate riders they are, have not ridden him half to death every day themselves, you can depend upon it they have been doing the same thing by proxy, by clandestinely hiring him out. At least, so I am informed. The result is that no horse has a chance to eat, drink, rest, recuperate, or look well or feel well, and so strangers go about the islands mounted as I was today. In hiring a horse from a Kanaka, you must have all your eyes about you, because you can rest satisfied that you are dealing with a shrewd, unprincipled rascal. You may leave your door open and your trunk unlocked as long as you please, and he will not meddle with your property. He has no important vices and no inclination to commit robbery on a large scale. But if he can get ahead of you in the horse business, he will take a genuine delight in doing it. This trait is characteristic of horse jockeys the world over, is it not? He will overcharge you if he can. He will hire you a fine-looking horse at night, anybody's, maybe the king's if the royal steed be in convenient view, and bring you the mate to my Oahu in the morning and contend that it is the same animal. If you make trouble, he will get out of it by saying it was not himself who made the bargain with you, but his brother, who went out in the country this morning. They have always got a brother to shift the responsibility upon. A victim said to one of these fellows one day, "But I know I hired the horse of you because I noticed that scar on your cheek." The reply was not bad. "Oh, yes, my brother, all same. We twins." A friend of mine, J. Smith, hired a horse yesterday, the Kanaka warranting him to be in excellent condition. Smith had a saddle and blanket of his own, and he ordered the Kanaka to put these on the horse. The Kanaka protested that he was perfectly willing to trust the gentleman with the saddle that was already on the animal, but Smith refused to use it. The change was made. Then Smith noticed that the Kanaka had only changed the saddles and had left the original blanket on the horse. He said he forgot to change the blankets, and so to cut the bother short, Smith mounted and rode away. The horse went lame a mile from town, and afterward got to cutting up some extraordinary capers. Smith got down and took off the saddle, but the blanket stuck fast to the horse, glued to a procession of raw places. The Kanaka's mysterious conduct stood explained. Another friend of mine bought a pretty good horse from a native a day or two ago, after a tolerably thorough examination of the animal. He discovered today that the horse was as blind as a bat in one eye. He meant to have examined that eye and came home with a general notion that he had done it, But he remembers now that every time he made the attempt, his attention was called to something else by his victimizer. One more instance, and then I will pass to something else. I am informed that when a certain Mr. L, a visiting stranger, was here, he bought a pair of very respectable-looking match horses from a native. They were in a little stable with a partition through the middle of it, one horse in each apartment. Mr. L examined one of them critically through a window, the Kanaka's brother having gone to the country with the key, and then went around the house and examined the other through a window on the other side. He said it was the neatest match he had ever seen, and paid for the horses on the spot. Whereupon the Kanaka departed to join his brother in the country. The fellow had shamefully swindled L. There was only one match horse, and he had examined his starboard side through one window and his port side through another. I decline to believe this story, but I give it because it is worth something as a fanciful illustration of a fixed fact, namely that the Kanaka horse jockey is fertile in invention and elastic in conscience. You can buy a pretty good horse for $40 or $50, and a good enough horse for all practical purposes for $2.50. I estimate Oahu to be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 cents. A good deal better animal than he was sold here day before yesterday for $1.75 and sold again today for $2.25. Williams bought a handsome and lively little pony yesterday for $10 and about the best common horse on the island, and he is a really good one, sold yesterday with Mexican saddle and bridle for $70. A horse which is well and widely known and greatly respected for his speed, good disposition, and everlasting bottom. You give your horse a little grain once a day. It comes from San Francisco and is worth about 2 cents a pound, and you give him as much hay as he wants. It is cut and brought to the market by natives and is not very good. It is brought to the market by natives and is not very good. It is baled into long round bundles about the size of a large man. One of them is stuck in the middle on each end of a 6-foot pole, and the Kanaka shoulders the pole and walks about the streets between the upright bales in search of customers. These hay bales thus carried have a general resemblance to a colossal capital H. The hay bales cost 25 cents apiece, and one will last a horse about a day. You can get a horse for a song, a week's hay for another song, and you can turn your animal loose among the luxuriant grass in your neighbor's broad front yard without a song at all. You do it at midnight and stable the beast again before morning. You have been at no expense thus far, but when you come to buy a saddle and bridle, they will cost you from $20 to $35. You can hire a horse, saddle, and bridle at from $7 to $10 a week, and the owner will take care of them at his own expense. It is time to close this day's record. Bedtime. As I prepare for sleep, a rich voice rises out of the still night, and as far as this ocean rock is towards the end of the earth, I recognize the familiar home air, but the words seem somewhat out of joint. Waikiki, Iantoni oe ka'ahuli huli wahu. Translated, that means, when we were marching through Georgia. Okay. I do not know that song, but that does conclude our reading for today and for this week. As previously mentioned, we have just one more week of readings to conclude our read along together of Roughing It by Mark Twain. And I do hope that you will take the opportunity to vote on what you would like to read next. At the start of our next reading together on Monday, the 19th, we'll announce what we'll read next following this book. So thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining me for today. Thank you for joining me for this book. And indeed, thank you for joining me for this past year of reading together. It's been a real pleasure. Bye, friends.